Hey friends, it's Sam from DIY Hunters, and today I'm going to show you how I made a matching set of resin riverside tables for my coffee table by just upgrading the tops of some old nesting tables that I didn't really like. So let's get started. I've had this set of nesting tables that I have had the ultimate love-hate relationship with. I absolutely hate the tops, but I love the metal bases and how well they fit together. So I decided that instead of throwing them out or starting a project from scratch, that I would just replace the tops of the tables and keep the metal bases and make something that matches my brand new Resin River coffee table. In all honesty, since I built these tables, I have lost the Allen key that I used to put them together, and luckily, as part of Home Depot's Prospective program this year, I did get my hands on some drilling and driving sets from RYOBI, and they had all of the bits that I needed to take the tops off of these tables. I also got my hands on a brand new combo kit that included a drill and a driver, so I used those tools along with the bits to remove the metal legs from the tabletops. And while I disassembled the tables, I made sure to keep everything in pristine order because I'm pretty much going to be recycling everything for this project, including the tabletops to use as templates later, which you'll see in a little bit. I also made sure to carefully store all of the bolts that came with the table into a Ziploc bag because I will even be reusing those along with the threaded inserts. And once everything was set aside, it was time to start preparing the lumber for this project. Now, I had used a walnut slab that I had gotten from one of my buddies, Jeff Mack, up in Canada for my river table, and I did have the same wood left over in my shop, so I used the rest of it for this project so that the nesting tables would match the coffee table. And to get started, I did run these slabs through my planer and also clean up any of the excess bark. Now, if you don't have a large surface planer in your workshop like I do, there are some other options that you can use. You can ask your local lumberyard to flatten the slabs for you, or you can use a powered hand planer. I actually built the coffee table that will match these nesting tables using all powered hand tools, and you can check out that tutorial on my channel just to see what that looks like in case you don't have some of the tools that I'm using in this specific project. Of course, as always, you can always visit my website as well to check out a full list of the tools and materials that I use for this project, as well as some alternatives. And the link for that is right below this video in the video description. Okay, now back to business. So after prepping, planing, debarking my slabs, it was then time to figure out how the heck I was going to lay out these tables. To do this, I kind of played around with the positioning of all of the slabs and then brought those tabletops back in to kind of trace them, figure out if everything was going to fit okay, and also kind of decide where I wanted the pattern to lie because I knew that it would be a little different than the river table, but also kind of similar. I then had to square and trim these boards so that they fit nicely in the molds later, and the safest way that I felt like I could do this was using a track saw, which is basically just a circular saw that runs up against a track to keep it straight. If you don't have a track saw, you could just use a circular saw and a straight edge. I show a lot of this in the Resin River table, so if you are curious about what I mean by that, you can check out that tutorial to see it in action. But once I made all of my cuts, I was able to then figure out the dimensions of my melamine mold for the resin pour. One question that I do get asked kind of time and time again after doing epoxy resin projects is if you can reuse the melamine molds that you create for your projects. Realistically, I have no idea, so I decided to try it out for this project. I kept all of the pieces that I used for the Resin River table, and I used them to create a brand new mold for the two smaller side tables. Now, in order to make sure that this recycled Franken-mold thing that I'm making would work for this specific project, I brought back the original tabletops and used them as general guidelines for how big I wanted these molds to be. Essentially, I wanted to cut these square-ish shapes into perfect circles later, so that required some excess room in the mold so that I have enough room to cut it down and trim it into a circle. And now this could be done using a circular saw, a table saw, whatever saw you have on hand. In the Resin River table, I used a circular saw and a straight edge, but I decided to kind of use a combination of my track saw and my table saw here just to streamline the process a little bit. And once my larger pieces were cut, it was time to recycle the sidewalls that I used on my original molds, and I did this by cutting them to size on my miter saw. At this point though, I did realize that I did not have enough melamine to make a full mold for both of the circular tabletops, so I just cut some more on my miter saw from a fresh sheet of melamine. Okay, real talk, this is kind of the part of the project where I got a little paranoid about reusing the melamine molds. The sidewalls and the tape on the sidewalls that was already used looked like they were in pretty rough shape from when I pried them away from the other mold that I made, so I actually decided to flip these pieces over and use Tyvek tape on the untaped sides of the sidewalls. And once everything was taped and secure, I then clamped everything together and began to assemble the molds. Now, very quickly back to giving ultimate props to that RYOBI drill and driving set, because it literally had everything I needed to make these melamine boards go together super smoothly. It had drill bits for pre-drilling the holes, it had a countersink bit so that the screws had a place to sit nice and tightly and flush into the mold, and it also had the bits that I needed for my particular screws. And I'm not gonna lie, one thing that made this come together very quickly was having both that drill and that driver laying around, because I was able to keep dedicated bits in each one and just switch back and forth really quickly. And once those melamine molds were assembled, I used a vacuum to vacuum out all of the debris to prepare the mold for sealing. And to seal up those cracks, I used a 100% silicone caulking and just applied it using a gun and used my fingers to smooth out the seams. And after letting the silicone dry, it was then time to lay out all of my boards and figure out what design I wanted to do. And once I did that, I then just vacuumed out the mold one more time to get rid of any debris prior to using resin. Now, if you've been following me for a while, you will know that I am borderline obsessed with epoxy resin and wood projects. I've done a lot of them on my channel, and I don't foresee myself slowing down anytime soon. But that being said, I get a lot of questions about epoxy resin in general, so my hope is that while I walk through the steps here of how I did the pour, that I'm also answering a lot of the questions that I get. Now, as you can see, the first step here is that I always clamp my slabs down to my mold so that they don't float when the resin is added later. And after I do that, I use a thin seal of resin to coat the live edge so that no bubbles form when the resin is curing. Once that thin coat of resin gels, it's then ready for the deep pour, because the deep pour will then adhere to that gelling resin. And so before beginning that deep pour, I do start by making sure that my molds are completely level so the resin doesn't pool to one side or another. Side note, this Bosch laser level is amazing and I'm kind of obsessed with it. It has so many functions, including a level, finding volume, it can measure distance. It's just overall awesome. Anyway, back to the project. Once it's time for the big pour, I always choose a specific deep pour epoxy because it allows me to pour up to about an inch at a time. Really important though, any epoxy resin you use is super temperature sensitive, which means that you need to pour somewhere where the temperature is controlled and it doesn't get too hot. So I always pour in a well-ventilated room that is kept at about 68 to 70 degrees consistently, but you may need to follow whatever instructions are on your specific brand of epoxy to figure out what that ideal temperature is for curing. But ultimately, once I mixed up that epoxy resin and added in my pigment, I then poured it all at once into the molds. I then hovered a torch above the epoxy resin just to pop any of the bubbles, and this allowed it to cure without any bubbles in the surface later. I then let the tabletops sit and do their thing and cure for about a day and a half before I then brought them back into my workshop. Once the tabletops were back in my shop, it was time to remove those melamine molds, and I did this by just unscrewing the molds using my drill and my driver. And because the resin does not stick to the Tyvek tape, it was actually pretty easy to pull those sidewalls away from the tabletops. I just gave them a little love tap and they popped right off. Now, when it came time to removing the bottom of the melamine mold from the tabletops, that was a completely different story. I actually had to use a chisel and a hammer to kind of pry those two pieces away from each other, but after a few tries, the melamine mold kind of just popped right off. And once those tabletops were set free, it was time to get them to their final thickness and clean them up. When I'm working with thicker slabs and I know I need to remove a lot of material and I know that it doesn't fit inside of my surface planer, I do like to use my handheld power planer. And to avoid gouging or sniping the wood, I work in really small passes, and I start on one side of the board and work my way to the center, and then I start on the other side of my board and meet that center line. I then also like to use my belt sander to just smooth out any of the rough lines that may be left behind. At this point in the project, I was just looking for really flat boards, so once my boards were flat, I then used my jigsaw in order to cut them into circles. Now, cue the paranoia again, because I was so nervous about cutting out these tabletops that I did use those melamine molds and some scrap wood to practice my circular cuts with the jigsaw about 10 times before I finally pulled the trigger on the final piece. But once I was finally ready to make some moves, I used the original tabletop to trace my circle onto my new tabletop, and then I used my jigsaw to cut this circle out. I did originally want to do this using my router and a circle cutting jig, but the circle cutting jig that I have requires me to drill multiple holes in the top of the table, and I wasn't willing to do that. So instead, I just cut a little bit outside of the circle line with my jigsaw, and then I'm gonna clean it up later using a flush trim bit on my router. Confession time, I have never used a flush trim router bit before, and now that I have, I'm convinced this thing is like voodoo magic. Basically, I was able to use the original tabletop as a template for a perfect circle, and then I clamped that to the bottom of my new tabletop, which I want to be a perfect circle. And then I ran my router with the flush trim bit around the perimeter of that circle, and the bottom of the bit ran along the template while the top of the bit trimmed my tabletop into a gorgeous, beautiful, streamlined, circular tabletop. I could not have been happier, I could not have been messier, and I'm pretty sure that I'm hooked on using this thing for the rest of my life. I used to just use a sander and try to sand the edges of my cuts perfectly flat, but I'm pretty sure I'm never going back to doing that ever again. Speaking of sanding though, once I was done cutting out my circles and making sure that they were beautiful, it was then time to sand these pieces down to their final grit. I started at about 120 and I worked my way to sanding the resin all the way to 400 grit. At this point, I actually finished the tabletops using a spray-on oil-based poly, but I ended up hating it, so we're going to skip over that part for a second, and I'm going to talk about how I installed the legs first. Lucky for me, I had a template to work off of, so I just stole the measurements for the legs off of those original tabletops and recycled the threaded inserts as well as the bolts, and I installed the threaded inserts by pre-drilling holes and then threading them into those holes with a little bit of epoxy resin. I then just used the original bolts to install the metal legs into those threaded inserts. And backtracking a bit, I absolutely hated the spray-on oil-based poly, so I definitely don't recommend it. I ended up having to sand down the entire tabletop and start fresh, and I ended up using a furniture finish that I liked instead, and it really turned out wonderfully in the end. All in all, I'm super happy with my decision to upcycle the bases of those nesting tables rather than just throw them out or buy something new. This project was really just a reminder to myself that you don't always have to completely start from scratch. And in all honesty, I've been wanting to make a matching side table for my resin river table anyway, and now I just get two for the price of one. And look, if epoxy resin projects aren't your jam, I totally get it. If anything, I hope that this project inspires you to take a piece of existing furniture that you have in your home and put your own taste and your own flair into it. I do hope that you guys loved this project as much as I do, and if you did, please make sure to subscribe to my channel for more projects in the very near future. But until then, friends, thank you so much for your support, and happy DIYing.